Hello, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for joining us here in our optimal webinar series, The Hidden Cost of Toxic Employees. It is a pleasure to see those again who had joined in our previous sessions, and a very warm welcome for those who are joining us here for the first time. My name is Katherine from Optimal Hong Kong, and I will be your host today. So our chosen topic today is actually something I believe that resonates quite widely, I would say, as almost everyone in the workplace has encountered an individual or people whose behavior seems to make the job a little bit more stressful than it should be. So these toxic employees, I think, rarely affects only one person. The impact often spreads across the workplace. So even if we haven't personally experienced it, most of us would have heard from colleagues, friends, or people that you know who have to work with these individuals. Now, while these employees may sometimes be dismissed as just simply a little bit more difficult, but actually the impact goes far beyond everyday frustrations. While the effect seems to have personal or temporary effects, toxic employees often create hidden costs that reach out far beyond individual conflicts. They could affect morale, productivity, retention, and employee well-being as well. So in this session, we will learn about what is the true cost of toxic employees. We will also deep dive into the science behind destructive behaviors and also discuss about some strategies to prevent these toxic hires. So for today's presentation, we are very fortunate to have Dr. Ryne Sherman, Chief Science Officer from Hogan Assessments, to share with us on this topic. From Optimal, we have myself, and also from the participant list, you will probably also see my colleagues from our different locations as well. So as we are going through the presentation, if you have any questions, comments about the topic, please feel free to scan the QR code at the beginning of the slides, which you will see later. And also it is shared in the chat box as well to input your questions. So all these questions will be addressed during the Q&A session in the end. We also have taken notes of some questions that you had during the registration as well. So without further delay, I will pass the time to Ryan to begin.
Well, thank you, Katherine. Thank you for having me here. Always wonderful to speak with our amazing friends at Optimal Consulting and from all of the different places where you all work and do business. One of our favorite places to go visit for sure is in any of your locations, whether that's Singapore, Hong Kong, Japan, wherever it may be. So thanks for having us. I wish I could be there in person. I wish we could do this in person, but sometimes we get to do it in person as well. But I'm happy to do this one virtually. So thanks for having me. I also want to acknowledge my colleagues who are joining from Hogan Assessments today on the call: Krista Pedersen, Nicole Dickey, and Anne-Marie Paymont, who are all on the call and work in various regions throughout Asia Pacific and are always available to help in your time zone. If you could use any assistance from them, they're here. I'm going to talk today, as Katherine, with a wonderful introduction, mentioned about toxic employees and the hidden cost. You also mentioned, Katherine, this QR code, which is here. So I'll leave this slide up for just a few seconds in case anyone wants to use that link to prepare for questions. Hopefully you don't have any questions yet, but maybe you do, and you can go ahead and put those in, and we'll tackle those towards the end of the talk. So this is the overview of what I'm going to cover today. I'm going to talk about leadership and talent at the start, and then we're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about the base rate of bad employees and an important distinction between incompetent versus toxic workers. And then, as promised, we will talk about the cost of toxic workers and have some time for some Q&A at the very end. So if you've heard me talk before, you probably know, or heard anyone from Hogan talk before, you probably know that leadership is one of the central areas that we focus on. We focus on leadership because we know that leadership is one of the most important questions in our organizations. When good leadership is in place, good things happen. Organizations and nations prosper. People keep their jobs. People get promoted. Shareholders gain shareholder value. When bad leadership is in place, we see the opposite things happen. Shareholders lose shareholder value. Sometimes organizations disappear. Sadly, if we look around the world, when bad leadership is in place, sometimes people lose their lives. In the corporate world, we know that the CEO accounts for somewhere between 17 and 30% of the variability in firm financial performance. The only thing that accounts for more than that is the industry. So, who's in charge of the organization has an outsized impact on the organization. And at Hogan, we talk a lot about leadership because leadership is so important. However, what happens if we ask leaders what challenges they face? What if we sort of flip the script a little bit and ask leaders what are the biggest issues that you face in your organizations? Now, this is not a real person, as you may have imagined. This is an AI generated image of a tech CEO. But I didn't want to show the real person's image here because I didn't want to get permission to show it. But this was from a CEO of a tech company who we were speaking with a couple of years ago. And this is what he told us. He said, I spend 10% of my time dealing with client-related issues and 90% of my time dealing with employees and their problems. It would be nice if those were reversed. So this was one frustration that the CEO expressed, that they're dealing with a lot of internal employee problems, not so much dealing with bigger business problems themselves. This is from a lawn care CEO, also not a real picture, also AI generated. I love the AI generation here. I love how it says CEO is what it says on his name tag. What a great name tag. Thank you, AI. But I was speaking with this lawn care CEO and I asked, hey, it must be great to run your own business. And he said, all of my employees' problems become my problems. And I thought, wow, that really highlighted this is basically the same thing that this tech CEO told us as well. And so a few years ago, the Center for Creative Leadership did some research on 48,000 leaders across 7,000 organizations around the world. And they asked them about their biggest problems. What are the biggest challenges you face as a leader? And they broke it out into different groups. So frontline supervisors, this is what they said. They had frustrations with time and people, their difficulty managing people for the first time, some deficient operational processes, and so on. They also had mid-level managers. They said that they have their biggest problem was their ineffective personal styles, having cross-functional influence, competing with other people and other project priorities. And then executives said that they had challenges with the strategic responsibilities, their own interpersonal rigidity, and some of the organizational readiness, and an inability to get people to cooperate across different divisions. So what I did was I went through this list, these top problems that CCL identified across managers and leaders of all levels, and thought, well, which ones are the people problems? And it turns out about half, at least half of the major problems reported by leaders around the world are actually other people issues. And so from there, I conclude that the number one problem that organizations face, that organizational leaders face, are the people problems. That's the biggest issue that organizations face is how do we handle people? Now, there's two parts to that problem. The first part of the problem is attracting talent. This has been a problem for a long time. McKinsey wrote about the war on talent over 20 years ago. But the key question is this: can we find enough talent? And there are global concerns about a lack of talent, although with artificial intelligence changing things, there's a lot of concerns about where is talent going to go? What kind of jobs do we have for talent? And can we find the right talent to fill these new jobs that are emerging in our economies today? At the same time, the second problem that organizations face is how do we retain and engage our current talent? How do we keep people motivated? We know that engagement is the number one predictor of turnover, absenteeism, satisfaction, workplace productivity. Pretty much any organizational outcome that people care about is predicted by engagement. We've also seen lots of recent trends in the last few years, from quiet quitting to quiet cracking and a number of others that are emerging as sort of underlying organizational issues. And so there's a real concern about attracting enough talent and real concern about retaining and engaging our talent. I also like to point out here that these problems are exacerbated for organizations that don't have a product. So if you're Apple and you make an iPhone, as long as you make a really high quality product, you don't necessarily have to have the best people and the best talent. Your organization's probably still going to be okay. But organizations that don't have a product, like investment firms or consulting firms, it's all about talent. Getting the right talent is absolutely crucial for them to be successful. So this leads us to a pretty simple question here. How much talent is there, or the inverse of that question, how many bad employees are there really out there? So Bob Hogan and I were talking about this several years ago, and the question was this right here. What is the base rate of bad employees? And it turns out answering this question is not so straightforward. Now, for a number of years, Hogan and Gallup and a number of others have done a lot of surveys, a lot of research around the base rate of toxic leaders. And we know that somewhere between 60 and 75% of leaders fail to create high performing teams. That's right, this isn't just toxic leaders, this is just bad leaders in general. And we know this has been true for at least 40 years, probably much longer than that. But when we look at the base rate of bad employees, not leaders, right? Non-leaders, how many are ineffective themselves? And there aren't a ton of data on the question. Now, the Pareto principle, which I'm guessing many of you or all of you are familiar with, suggests that 20% of employees do 80% of the work and vice versa. So that suggests that maybe 80% of the employees are not that effective or not really high-performing employees. Gallup again reports that about 1/3 of all employees are actively disengaged. That is, saying bad things about the organization, sort of actively destructive towards the organization's performance. And a number of sources around the world, including the Society for Human Research Management, suggest that at least 10% of the workforce are toxic employees. So we've got a variety of numbers here that might tell us, well, okay, maybe there's a lot of bad employees. 80%, 10%, 33%. What is the true base rate of bad employees? I think it's also worth pointing out that lots of this research, when we look at research on the term toxic employees, it doesn't really distinguish between toxic employees and incompetent employees or just bad employees in general. Lots of studies use the word toxic, and I think that's done because it's more attention grabbing. If I say, oh, we're studying toxic employees, that sounds more attention grabbing than I'm saying I'm studying ineffective employees or I'm studying employees who aren't very good at their jobs. So a lot of the literature talks about toxic employees, but it's not always clear that those studies are actually about toxic employees, partly because the definitions of what counts as a toxic employee, what counts as a bad employee are poor, somewhat convenient, and often inconsistent across different research studies. So when Bob Hogan and I were talking about this, we decided to start with a little bit of a research venture. What's the difference between toxic and incompetent employees? Can we really create a definition of these two differences? And so I'm going to work through that here with you here and walk you through this process of how we distinguish between incompetent versus toxic employees. So when I think about incompetent employees, I think about these are employees who leave work for others to complete, but don't create additional work. And I'll give you an example here. I like to use this water glass as an example. So you can imagine this water glass is the total amount of work that has to be done for an organization. The organization on any given day has to fill up this water glass to the brim. Let's say that's the total sort of workload that the organization faces. An incompetent employee doesn't contribute as much as they should. They don't put enough water into the glass. Somebody else has to come along and put extra water into the glass to make up for their lack of effectiveness, for their lack of talent. This is clearly emphasized by the free rider problem. That's one clear example of one kind of incompetent employee. And if you're not familiar with that, I have a little worked example here where we can talk about the free rider problem. So this is very common in behavioral economics research. They do what are called public goods games. And I have an example of a public goods games later. There's all kinds of varieties of them, but this is one example laid out here. So you can imagine everybody on this call, you can imagine has 10 coins, but I'll just play a hypothetical game with 4 people. Let's say we've got 4 people and they all have 10 coins. And you can think for yourself, what would you do in this situation? Now imagine you can privately invest anywhere between 0 and 10 coins into the public fund. The rest of the people on this call won't know how many coins you invest. So think about the number that you want to invest into the public fund. I guarantee you that I will double the total number of coins invested, and then I'm going to distribute those coins equally back to the public. Now, again, in my hypothetical game of 4 people, let's imagine that I ask the first person. Person A says, I will invest 10 coins. Person B, 10 coins. Person C, 10 coins. By the way, I do these all the time, and this is a very common pattern. And person D says 0 coins. Okay, so now I have 30 total coins. I agreed to double them, so I've doubled the number of coins. Now I have 60 coins, and I have to redistribute those coins equally back to the public. So person A, I give 15 coins, person B gets 15, person C 15, and person D 15 coins. Now, let's total up and see how many coins everyone has. Person A invested 10, got 15. They've got 15 now. Nice investment. Person B, same thing. A gain of 5 coins, a nice investment. Person C, same thing, a nice investment. But person D now has 25 coins. The person who invested the least now has the most. So these public goods games are used all the time. And what happens is if you play the game once like that, some smart person figures out the optimal investment is the least, the smallest amount that you can invest. But what would happen if everybody invested zero? Then there would be no return for the public. And so what happens if you play the game multiple times, people learn, people go, wait a minute, if I give less, I'll make more. And so eventually people start to learn to give less, and this creates free riders. So this exercise is a clear demonstration of the problem of free riders. Free riders are a burden on the organization. They create organizational disengagement. Imagine if you're in the workplace and you're filling the glass up with water, and you look over and your colleague isn't putting any water in. How engaged do you feel? Do you feel like tomorrow you're going to come in and put just as much water in? Probably not. And ultimately, what happens in these public goods games is the entire public fund dissipates. Everybody decides, well, I'm not going to invest any, and nobody else is going to invest any. Right? And when that happens in our organizations fall apart. Our organizations fail. Unfortunately, there's no way to stop free riders from accumulating. Free riders will always join in to organizations because they get a free ride. So it's on leadership to try to identify potential free riders and to eliminate them or get them to stop free riding, because it's such a burden on the rest of the organization and it creates disengagement. However, a free rider isn't necessarily toxic. So that's just one kind of incompetent employee is a free rider, someone who's not adding additional or not doing their share of the work. There are other ways that we can identify potential incompetent employees as well. And one of those comes from some of Hogan's performance models. One of our performance models is called general employability. We have a report for general employability, but it measures 3 basic characteristics for job fit. Do you have people skills? Can you get along with others? Do you have learning skills? Can you learn the job? Can you learn new things quickly? And do you work hard? Do you show up on time? Do you produce high quality output while you're at work? If you have these 3 characteristics, you are employable for most every job in most economies. Most every job is looking for people who can do these 3 things. But Hogan also has job-specific profiles. We have a report called Express that has 9 different job families that are calibrated to predict performance in those jobs. So we can give people a fit score for any of these jobs, or managers and executives, supervisors, professionals, sales, customer support, a whole number of roles. Now, some years ago, we were looking at these different job families and our general employability. We have 10 different performance models here, one for all jobs, sort of generally, and then one set for very specific jobs. And we wondered how many people don't pass any of these jobs. That might be one way of telling us something about the base rate of incompetence. So what we did was we grabbed a large sample of people from our global norm. In this case, it was 59,000 people who had applied for a job. So this is a global sample. It's representative of the global working population. These are all job applicants. And we scored them on our model of general employability, and we scored them on those 9 Express job families. We used our standard cutoffs, which on general employability is the 20th percentile. On Express, it's around the 33rd percentile. It sort of depends which job family, but it's approximately the 33rd percentile. And it was a very simple criteria. I asked one of my research colleagues, just give me the total number of profiles passed for each person. And then tell me what percentage of people don't pass a single profile. And it turns out that's about 2.8% of people who did not pass a single profile Now, you might describe this profile, and I'm going to show you the profile here in a moment, as highly unemployable or low potential. That's sort of the way I like to describe it. It's the opposite of high potential. These are low potential employees. Now, I would argue that this is the bare minimum base rate for incompetence. Let's say 3%. Now, you have to keep in mind that these people had to not pass a single profile. There were some people who only passed one, or maybe just passed one, just barely. I didn't consider those to be incompetent by this definition. You literally had to fail every single one of these. The profile looks a bit emotionally erratic, somewhat insubordinate, and lacking in drive. And here's the profile here for those of you who are familiar with Hogan. The yellow are the HPI, our sort of bright side, who we are when we're at our best, who we are when we're putting our best foot forward. Adjustment concerns our emotional control. Ambition concerns drive and our willingness to push for results. Prudence concerns detail orientation, concerns working hard, being reliable, dependable, following rules. Interpersonal sensitivity concerns getting along with others. And these are all percentile scores. So we can see generally people scored pretty low on these sort of bright side characteristics. They scored really highly on those first 5 scales of the HTS. The HTS measures potential career derailers, things that might get us in trouble throughout our careers. And those first 5 are what we refer to as the moving away scales. These are scales where we avoid problems. We run away from problems. We run away from issues. Sometimes we're really emotional and emotionally erratic. That's what we see with excitable. Sometimes we have mistrust for others. That's skeptical. We're afraid to make a wrong decision, particularly in public. That's high cautious. We distance ourselves from others. That's high reserved. And we are outwardly agreeable, but inwardly disagreeable. That's high leisurely. So this is the profile of this low potential profile, this sort of highly unemployable person. And we know that about 3% of the population meets this criteria. So that suggests that a bare minimum base rate is about 3% of employees or 3% of the working population are really just not very employable. By the way, I point out that this is why I tend to be in favor of sort of social economic programs that help the disadvantaged, because I don't know what else you do, right? What do you do if you have 3% of people that really aren't a good fit for any job? We have to find something, right? So typically I'm pro those kinds of programs that can help people find some way to be useful contributors to society. So that's incompetent employees. And I mean, this really isn't very much fun stuff to talk about, but because it is kind of disheartening, but it's also just factual, right? This is just what the data tell us. But what about toxic employees? One way that I like to define toxic employees is that, if I'm going back to my glass analogy here, that they actually create additional work or problems to be solved. So sometimes toxic employees put lots of water in the glass, but when they do it, they spill water all over the place, and now somebody has to clean it up. Or they put a hole in the glass, and now water is leaking out, and somebody has to put even more water in. So it's not that toxic employees don't work. Oftentimes, toxic employees are quite talented in many ways, but they create additional problems that have to be solved. Whereas the incompetent employees don't create additional problems. They just don't do the amount of work that they're supposed to do. Toxic employees often do the amount of work they're supposed to do, but create so many additional problems that we have to wonder if they're really worth the value. So what actually constitutes toxic behavior? And this is, again, one problem is most of the literature doesn't really do a great job of defining toxic behavior. So I researched both the web and the academic literature and sort of summarized what are the key behaviors that show up as identified as toxic behaviors at work. These are the behaviors that you see: bullying, harassment, micromanagement, passive-aggressive behavior, spreading rumors, dishonesty, manipulativeness, narcissistic behavior, and putting others in danger. These are sort of the key consensus level toxic behaviors at work. And you say, well, do we have any measurement of those? Has anybody tried to measure these kind of behaviors at work? And it turns out IO psychologists have, although they call it something different. There's a whole field of research on what are known as counterproductive workplace behaviors. These are behaviors, what a nice way of saying it, right? Counterproductive workplace behaviors. This is the kind of thing you say to your kids. Now that's counterproductive behavior, Michael. Anyway, these behaviors are ones that IO psychologists have been studying for a long, long time. And many of them actually map pretty closely onto toxic behaviors. So things like theft, destruction of property, misuse of information, unsafe behaviors. Hello. Some of these are direct one-to-one correlations with what people call toxic behavior. Only poor attendance and poor work quality, I would consider that to be more incompetent behavior than truly toxic behavior. So if we just look at those toxic behaviors in the counterproductive workplace behavior literature, we can actually map these to Hogan scales. So what does toxic behavior look like in Hogan terms? What do people score in Hogan scales who commit these toxic behaviors? Well, we saw a couple of things from our research, and I've summarized this here. We do have a white paper or a technical report that you can read, and we can share with Optimal, and Optimal can share with you that details this research. But this is the summary here. We see people who score low on adjustment have a tendency to express anger and hostility. People who score low on prudence have a tendency to misuse their time and resources, to commit theft, to use drugs and alcohol at work, to engage in unsafe behavior, and to aggress towards others. People high on sociability have a tendency to use alcohol at work and engage in inappropriate verbal acts. I think we know what those are. People who are low on interpersonal sensitivity have a tendency to engage in anger, hostility, and aggression at work. And when we look at the HDS, we see a number of behaviors that somewhat overlap with those incompetent behaviors, but not totally. So excitable showed up under the incompetent employee profile. We see toxic workers engaging in impulsive and misusing information and resources. We also see skeptical. Again, this overlapped with that incompetent profile. But a couple of things emerged a little bit different. Toxic workers show up as high bold. Our incompetent workers didn't. Toxic workers show up as high mischievous. Our incompetent workers didn't. And finally, toxic workers also show up as high colorful, again, differentiating themselves from those incompetent workers. And you can see the behaviors that they engaged in here as well. So this suggests to us that the behavior of the incompetent employee, the profile, the personality profile of the incompetent employee is actually fairly different from that of the toxic worker. So that led us to one further question. What is the actual base rate of toxic workers? And again, we know the Society for Human Resource Management suggests that it could be as high as 10%. But we wondered, how many people actually fit that profile that we identified? Now, before we go there, I just want to summarize where we're at so far. We know that 3% of the working population have personality profiles that make them unsuitable for work in most jobs. We could describe this as a low profile or incompetent kind of employee profile. We see them as being insubordinate, unable to cooperate, unable to learn the job, and unable to productively complete tasks. But they're not necessarily toxic. When we look at toxic workers, by contrast, we see that about 6% of the working population have a profile that makes them destructive at work. You could describe this profile as hostile, manipulative, entitled, self-aggrandizing, impulsive, and lacking in empathy for others. So this turns us to the final little bit that we're going to talk about here today. What is the cost? What is the actual cost of toxic workers in the workplace? Now, one of my favorite books, and I have it back here, so I'm not lying, is called The $1 Million Hire. It's a pretty old book now, about 20, maybe a little more than 20 years old now. But the idea of this book was to understand, what does it actually cost us when we make a hiring mistake? And this book outlines what it costs you to make a six-figure hire. So it used US dollars, so I'll stay with US dollars here. But if we hired someone at a six-figure salary in US dollars, so that would be $100,000 or more. By the way, at the time, that was actually quite a bit of money. I don't know if it's considered quite a bit now, but certainly at the time, this was a substantial salary that someone was getting. David Jones estimated that that costs more than $1 million when you hire this person if you get it wrong. This includes recruiting costs, salary, benefits, bonuses, any turnover that you might have, your normal tenure expectations. Ultimately, it is a more than $1 million investment. That's the title for the book. It's the $1 million hire. You're not paying this person $1 million, but if you get it wrong, it costs you more than $1 million. Now, most companies, most organizations, not all, but at that time, again, this was quite a bit of money, would say that a $1 million hire or a $1 million investment, if I'm going to make a $1 million investment in, say, a piece of computer software, I would want to make sure I spent some time evaluating that and getting that decision right. But how many hiring decisions are made with that kind of time and care? The kind of time and care, the kind of vetting you would do to purchase a piece of software, to make an acquisition. How much of that is actually done to hire an employee? Oftentimes, people just hire employees because they had a good interview or they just liked them and they decide to hire them. And when we get it wrong, it's really, really costly. So that's just one example of how much toxic workers or how much a bad hire can cost us. A great paper on toxic workers by Michael Hausman and Dylan Miner from 2015. This is one of my favorite papers ever. The whole paper is all about personality. They don't mention personality except maybe once or zero times, either one time or zero times in the entire paper itself. They frame it up as being about toxic workers. They looked at more than 50,000 workers across 11 different firms. They had access to firm financial performance. They had access to all these toxic behaviors that were going on in these workplaces. And they were able to quantify the exact cost of a toxic worker on the workplace. And so the way they did that was kind of funny. So I'll just show you exactly what their final results looked like, and I'll walk you through what this means. So on the right-hand side, they showed that if you avoid a toxic worker, for every dollar invested in avoiding a toxic worker, it saves you $12.49. Again, they used US dollars, so that's what we have here. So it saved you $12.49 for every dollar invested in avoiding a toxic worker. So the question is, but what would it be worth if I spent that dollar trying to hire a superstar instead? And it depends on how you define superstar. If you define superstar as a top 25%, top 10%, top 5%, top 1%, your return changes. So for every $1 I invest in a top 25% employee, I get $1.95 back. That's almost double my investment. If I invest $1 and I get a top 10% employee, that's 3.2 times my investment. So I like to use 5%. I say, let's say top 5% is what we call superstars. So we're getting almost a 4-to-1 return on our investment if we hire a superstar. So if I invest $1, I get almost $4 back for that superstar I invested. But at the same time, if I spent that same dollar avoiding a toxic worker, I would get 3 times the return of that dollar in hiring a superstar. In other words, I would need to hire more than 4 superstars to make up for a single toxic worker. In other words, avoiding toxic workers is worth a heck of a lot more than hiring superstars. I put it here, I went through the report and replaced their numbers and put it a different way that might help explain it in a different way. If it works better for you, you can interpret it this way as well. Essentially, top performers generate an additional 7 to 19% of their compensation as additional revenue, whereas toxic employees cost an additional 44% of their total compensation. And we can use those numbers to better understand the total cost of toxic workers on entire economies. So I began first with the U.S. economy. We know that the average compensation in the U.S. is about $66,600. There's 163 million working people in the U.S. And we know with about 6% of them being toxic, we've got close to 10 million toxic employees. So the math is pretty simple. At a 44% additional cost, that is $286 billion drain on the U.S. economy caused by just 6% of all workers. I ran similar numbers for Singapore because I know some of you are joining us from there. If the average conference, and I saw various numbers, but this is what I found is the best estimate of my average compensation for Singapore. In Singapore dollars is 70,148. A working population of 4.12 million. Again, if we estimate that 6% are toxic with an additional 44% cost, that is an $8.4 billion drain on the Singapore economy. And of course, we can apply these numbers globally. The average compensation around the globe is around 10,000 US dollars. With 3.38 billion people working, that leaves us with only around 202 million toxic workers globally. At a cost of almost a total cost of $1 trillion. just under $900 billion in total cost for toxic workers globally. And for me, this is fascinating because we're talking about such a small percentage of the working population, just 6%, almost a $1 trillion drain on the global economy. Now, I could just leave you there, but I feel like that might be, leaving out some of the important things to do here. What do we do? What do we do about toxic employees? What is the solution to toxic employees? Well, when I hear about this kind of thing, or when I read work by Hausman and Miner, I think about personality. What can personality tell us about toxic employees? Well, we know that personality predicts every meaningful difference in our lives. So it predicts all kinds of individual outcomes like happiness and how long people live. It also predicts our interpersonal outcomes, including our friendship, relationship, our career status. And it predicts social outcomes too, like if we can join leadership positions, what kind of occupation we get into, and how we perform on the job. So we know personality predicts all these outcomes. In the workplace, we know that personality predicts job performance. This is now a very, very old, one of the first ever meta-analysis, is a classic in IO psychology. One of the first ever meta-analyses ever done looking at the relationship between personality and job performance. A meta-analysis is just a study that combines the results across many, many studies. And this is the key table of results. I've summarized them here. And what this shows is that conscientiousness is an important predictor of performance across almost every job that you could find in most economies, as well as extroversion and what they call extroversion. Now, one of the problems with this study is they just generally measure performance. They don't measure specific kinds of performance on the job. It's just general performance across all jobs, no matter what. If you align personality scales to performance, you can find a little bit something different here. And this is what was done by Joyce Hogan and Brent Holland some years ago. They actually used theory to align specific personality characteristics to specific job performance outcomes. And when you do that, and again, I've summarized it all here for you, you see much larger associations between personality and different aspects of job performance. So here we see correlations between 0.2 and 0.4. What does this mean? What does this mean in terms of real person terms? This means that if I hire somebody who actually has a good fit to our job profile, a good fit in terms of the behaviors we want to see regularly performed on the job, we increase our odds of getting a good fit by either 2 or 3 times the amount, somewhere between 2 and 3 times better probability of hiring someone who's a good fit for a job if we use a high quality personality assessment to evaluate them. As I mentioned earlier, we also know that personality predicts toxic behavior. This is that technical brief that I mentioned. Again, if you want a copy of this, you can contact Optimal, and Optimal can get you a copy of this technical brief. So we know personality predicts these toxic behaviors in the workplace. So how do we actually fix toxic behavior? Well, unfortunately, I don't think there's much hope to fixing a toxic personality profile. The goal of personality assessment, the goal of personality development isn't even to fix our personalities or to change our personalities. The goal is to understand our strengths and weaknesses, to get strategic self-awareness, and to try to change behaviors that might be seen as, in this case, less toxic or less counterproductive. However, most people are unwilling to go through the effort. It's really hard to change the kinds of behaviors that we want to engage in on a regular basis, the kind of behaviors that we want to engage in automatically. It can be done, but it takes a hard work and a lot of effort to do so. So your best bet, and this was what Hausman and Miner found. This is also what David Jones found as well. Your best bet is to avoid hiring toxic workers in the first place. Using high quality assessments is a great way to identify people who are likely to engage in these bad behaviors even before it starts. And again, I would say one of the biggest problems with toxic employees is that they often come across as very charming. They often come across as very talented. And we tend to fall in love with those talents and think, oh, well, those the things that are rough around the edges, we can put up with those. Oh, that bad behavior, we can put up with that. But often other people in your organization can't, and it's really, really costly. At the same time, personality assessments can be used across the entire employee life cycle. So obviously we can use personality assessments to identify potential toxic behavior during the talent acquisition phase. But we can also use personality assessments to try to point out some potentially toxic tendencies that individuals have during a feedback and development process. We can do this during our high potential and succession planning phase as well. We can say, hey, you're really high potential. We know you have a lot of talent. In fact, many toxic employees do end up in high potential programs because they have lots of talent. And that talent is what they've gone by on. And people have sort of put up with their toxic behavior for many years. So this is a great opportunity to coach around those toxic behaviors, to try to create shifts in those behaviors going forward. And of course, we can continue to use personality assessments through team effectiveness engagements and through executive coaching as well for the same kind of targeted behaviors there as well. So let me just wrap up with a few key points, and then we will take some questions here. So look, we know that employee quality is the number one issue that organizational leaders tell us that they're facing. We know that incompetent employees require backup. This is our definition. Hogan is defining incompetence as an employee who doesn't do the required amount of work, whereas a toxic employee creates additional work, additional burden on the organization. We know that the base rate, the bare minimum base rate of incompetent employees is around 3%. It's probably higher. Remember, you had to fail literally every single profile to get into that 3%. Probably it's a bit higher than that. And we also know that the bare minimum base rate for toxic employees is around 6%. Again, Society for Human Resource Management estimated it could be as high as 10%. Our estimate is around 6%. It's probably somewhere around 6, 8, somewhere in between there. We also know that toxic employees are $1 billion cost in most economies and almost $1 trillion cost on the global economy. And that if we use high quality assessments, we can help identify toxic behavior, toxic employees in the workplace before it even starts. With that, I say thank you very much.